me to begin not in ancient Athens, but in modern America at Harvard University, my alma mater. Every day, eager tourists visit this iconic statue of John Harvard, which bears the inscription, John Harvard, founder, 1638. But as the student tour guides love to point out, this is a statue of 3 lies. John Harvard was not the college's founder. He was just one of several founders, one of the early benefactors. Moreover, the college was founded not in 1638, but in 1636, 2 years before John Harvard left a substantial bequest of money and books to the new institution. And finally, the statue does not even depict John Harvard. When it was commissioned in the late 19th century, no one knew what he had looked like, so it was modeled on a young student instead. So I want to present the story of the ancient Athenian Kleisthenes as equally a story of at least 3 lies. So Kleisthenes lived in the late 6th century before the Common Era in Athens, which was a city-state, one of about 1,000 city-states in Greece, but it was the one in which democracy would be born, and indeed Kleisthenes was credited with having birthed it. He was described by the historian Herodotus as having established the democracy of the Athenians. Yet, that might lead us to think that Kleisthenes was the liberator of Athens. After all, if tyranny preceded the democracy, surely then in founding the democracy, he liberated the city. No. In fact, the overthrow of the tyrants was carried out by Spartan forces from a foreign city-state, the state of Sparta, which we'll discuss further. So, if Kleisthenes founded the democracy, we might expect that he was present and led the people in establishing the democracy. But no, at a crucial moment of popular action, Kleisthenes was actually absent, as again we'll see. And finally, if he would be remembered as having established the democracy, we might think that he would be publicly revered as its visible founder. But no, Kleisthenes would be rarely mentioned in public discourse in Athens, rarely presented as a figure on the Athenian stage, and again, we have no bust of him remaining from the time. We don't know what he looked like any more than we know in the case of John Harvard. So, Kleisthenes' story, this is a modern bust, but you can see this is a pre-AI classicizing interpretation of his face. It bears no resemblance, probably, to anything he might have looked like. And his story, then, as I've described, is puzzling and complicated, and it's relatively little known. We are far more familiar with the names of the great Athenian lawgiver Solon, who preceded Kleisthenes by a couple of generations, or the statesman Pericles, who led Athens in the Peloponnesian War 2 generations after him. But tonight, I want to fill in the gap of the Kleisthenic moment, because I think it has much to teach us about how democracy can be won and how it must be lived. And in fact, the very unheralded nature of the Kleisthenic moment suggests that democracy is never achieved once and for all. It is always a work in progress, which can be protected only by being repeatedly reinvented. So tonight, I want to explain how Kleisthenes engaged in partnering with the people. That's a gloss on what one of the ancient Greek historians tells us. And as a result of that, he was able to introduce 3 important reforms that collectively constituted key elements of Athenian democracy. And I call them radical redistricting, a popular agenda setting, and ostracism, which was a mechanism of occasional and deliberate political exile. But before we can get to those roles, I need to explain what happened before Kleisthenes, how a tyranny emerged in Athens, what we mean and what they meant by calling it a tyranny, and then how it came to an end before Kleisthenes came to power through partnering with the people in a new way. So, Athens in the 6th century before the Common Era. And at this moment in Athens, we see an evolution of an elite form of government. So it had laws, it had a few political offices that were defined by term limits and distinct powers. But the people holding those offices were constantly engaging in jockeying for power. And especially we saw that among two very influential familial clans, to one of which actually Kleisthenes himself would belong. So I've described in previous lectures how the city eventually put an end to that period of factional strife by inviting Solon to lay down a new set of laws to reconcile the conflicting sides. And these laws were a success. They were never formally abolished. So the status quo before the tyranny was that people could hold office, and these were all still elite people, people from the upper economic stratum. They could hold office and rule according to the laws. And that was a way of trying to keep the elite conflict in check. But about 30 years after Solon's law-giving, Pisistratos, who was a relative of Solon's, in fact, and had been elected as a general, so he'd embarked on a standard political career of office holding, but he decided that he didn't want to play within those established rules of the Athenian political game. Instead, he wanted to hold power of a different kind and to come to power through a different path. So he carried out an ingenious political ruse. He actually wounded himself, cast the blame on his political enemies, and induced the people to set up a bodyguard to protect him, only to turn that bodyguard against the people, seize the Acropolis, and take power as what was called then a tyrant. So Pisistratos is the founder of the tyranny that's holding power before Kleisthenes takes office. Now, what, though, did they mean by calling him a tyrant? And our word tyrant comes from the Greek word tyrannos, and it's the word that people used at the time and subsequently in Greek writing to talk about him. But the meaning of tyrant there is complicated. It's another one of those semi-lies that we need to understand. Because while eventually the dynasty that he established would come to rule as what we would think of as a family of tyrants, we will come to see them actually holding and exercising power cruelly and illegally. But initially, at least, Pisistratos seems to have been thought of as a tyrant in an older sense of the word, which was a sense of someone who didn't come to power through heredity or through election, in his case, through deception and force, but in the case of some other tyrants of the time, perhaps just by shouldering his way to be the first among equals. So the sense is you didn't come to power through an established route, but it didn't necessarily mean that you had used deception and force, although he himself did. And also, in saying that he was a tyrant, we mean that he was exercising power that was not limited by the bounds of established political office. But again, that doesn't mean that he was misusing his powers, at least initially, and we'll see that, in fact, he was initially welcomed as a kind of moderate ruler. So there's a question about the nature of his rule. He was not initially perceived as tyrannical in what would become the modern pejorative sense. The historian Herodotus would say he exercised moderate and good government. He neither disrupted the existing political offices nor changed the laws, but he managed the city in accordance with its existing legal and political institutions, so those institutions of Solon. Our other main narrative for the period agrees. It says he ran the state constitutionally rather than as a tyrant. This is a text of 2 centuries later, so it already has the pejorative sense of tyrant and is saying he wasn't a tyrant in that sense. He was ruling moderately constitutionally. So you might think that my own title for this lecture was a bait and switch. I promised to tell you about the switch from tyranny to democracy, but the tyranny doesn't sound so bad. But that, too, is a little bit too simple. Because Pisistratos was the proverbial benevolent despot. He was benevolent, moderate, constitutional, so long as his will was not crossed and no one asserted powers in opposition. I like to say in American vernacular that he sought to keep the people down on the farm. And by that I mean, and we're told this in our historical texts, that he sought to prevent them from actively engaging in politics. So Herodotus again tells us he did not want the people in the city, but scattered in the country. They should be on their farms, on their homesteads, not meddling in politics, which they should leave actually up to him. And in fact, at one point, he literally disarmed the people. So before I come to this quotation, let me explain its context, and I'll illustrate it. Pisistratos gave a speech, speaking so softly that the people had to come forward to hear him, to the point that they were so close up that his henchmen could surround them, collect their weapons, and lock them away. Don't worry, that's also not in the plan for this evening, no more than the fire drill. So after that, he told the crowd not to be surprised or alarmed by what had happened to their weapons, but they should go home, look after their private affairs, and he would take care of the state. So he could be moderate, he could be constitutional, but he deprived Athens of active popular vigilance. And the ultimate effect of that is that even though Solon's laws were still officially in force, we're told that they had fallen into disuse under the tyranny. So as a tyrant, he didn't abolish the laws. He didn't even necessarily visibly controvert them, but he let them fall into disuse because no one could sort of act on their entitlements and claim what was due to them under the laws. Everything was left in his hands. And so that's the further lie of the thought that Solon's laws remained in force and Pisistratos governed according to them. In one way, they were there on the books, written up on the walls and on boards in the city, as I've talked about in previous lectures. But in another way, those laws had been hollowed out. And that's going to be a theme that recurs throughout my series of lectures this year, which is devoted to political crises in Athens and Rome. Again and again, we'll see the crisis that happens when laws become hollowed out. They're on the books, but they cease to be meaningful. They cease to be able to control power as they're intended to do. Okay, but for now, then back to Athens. So let's look at how the tyranny eventually came to an end. So a crucial role, though not the final role, was played by these two men, Harmodius and Aristogeiton, who would be remembered by later Athenians as the tyrannicides. So what happened? Pisistratos died in 527, and his eldest son, Hippias, took over. So he did take over in a hereditary way, but still operating outside the established offices. But one of his half-brothers, so one of Pisistratos' other sons, outraged some powerful men in the city, these two men and their allies and friends, who then conspired to assassinate the tyrant. But they thought that they had been betrayed, and so they lashed out too early, and they ended up assassinating his brother instead. So the tyrant remained in power. So here's another lie. These men were remembered as the tyrannicides. That's the name later Athenians gave them. They were commemorated on Athenian vases, in statues with oaths and rituals. They didn't actually kill the tyrants, and they didn't put an end to the tyranny. In fact, what their assassination of the brother did was prompt the ruling tyrant, now the son Hippias, son of Pisistratus, to become much more brutal. So he started ruling pejoratively in the sense that we would describe him as tyrannical today. He ruled viciously and harshly, and in fact drove many Athenians, including Kleisthenes, a prominent man already in the city at that time, into exile. Okay, so the tyrant is still in power. How was he finally toppled? Not by the tyrannicides. In fact, by a ruse that led to foreign intervention. So a group of the Athenian exiles came up with a cunning plan. They decided that what was needed was to enlist a foreign power, and in particular Sparta, another city-state, which was a sometime ally of Athens, sometime its rival, of course, would become its great rival half a century later in the Peloponnesian War. But at this time, the Spartans were sometimes acting as a kind of freelance military force. And so what these Athenians did was they went to the Delphic oracle, pictured there on the left, and they bribed the priestess who revealed the oracle's words to tell any Spartan who should come to ask her any question, the Spartans should free the Athenians from the tyrants. So she whispered this into the ear of enough Spartans that eventually the Spartans agreed to follow her advice. They were pious and suggestible, and so they sent one of their kings to besiege the city of Athens. And as a result of that siege, the family of the tyrant fled into exile, and that was what actually put the tyranny to an end. So, where does Kleisthenes come in? Well, he comes back into the city. Now it's been freed from tyranny. They go back to their previous elite mode of government. They are operating under Solon's laws. And Kleisthenes at this point emerges as one of two main figures struggling for power against a rival, Isagoras, whom we'll see pictured in a moment. And Kleisthenes at this point made a fateful choice that really hadn't been made before him by any other Athenian political leader. He decided to enlist the common people into his association of supporters. That's Herodotus. Or in another source, we're told that he brought the demos, meaning in this context, the common people, into his group of comrades. And this is what I like to call partnering with the people. So this was unprecedented for an elite statesman in Athens, and indeed in any Greek polis at the time, to do. Solon had given the common people some roles in politics, but he had taken pride in positioning himself in the middle between the poor and the rich. So he was doing the opposite of siding with the people. He was trying to stand in between, be in a no man's land, as he puts it in his poetry. And Pisistratos, as tyrant, as we saw, had sought popular support, but he really wanted to keep the people passive and quiescent. He didn't want to actively engage them on his side. So what Kleisthenes does is something really innovative. He enlists the people on his team, and he makes clear to them that he is going to act on their behalf. So he's now the champion of the people, but the people are his active supporters, not just being kept quiescent and passive and content. And it's that which explains the remarkable event of a few years later, because the Spartans decide to seize the Acropolis again. This time, they're not coming to liberate from tyranny, but they're actually coming to side with Isagoras, the figure you see on the left, who was the great rival to Kleisthenes. And whereas Kleisthenes is the champion of the people, Isagoras is the champion of an even more elitist model of government. In fact, the Spartans want to put him in charge of simply 300 active citizens, so dramatically reducing the roles of active citizens and those who can be involved involved in politics. So the Spartans seize the Acropolis and think, we've done it before, we can do it again. We'll come in and be victorious in Athens. And this is the point at which Kleisthenes and many of his allies, especially elite allies, flee the city, possibly in order to try to regroup and participate in the battle, but they are not present at the crucial moment. So what's the crucial moment? The Athenians, as a body of people, the common people, on behalf of the council refuses to obey its ordered dissolution, and the Athenian people back them up. So they besiege the Spartans, who have occupied the Acropolis, and they force them to leave under a truce. So it's this action of popular power in support of constitutional institutions which achieves this second liberation, which is going to now allow for full democratization. And it's in the wake of that popular victory that Kleisthenes then is recalled by the people, and now he's going to be able to pass new institutional reforms to consolidate the power which the people have expressed and gained. So there's a sense in which we can say that the Athenians pulled themselves up toward democracy by their own bootstraps. They didn't yet have democracy, and yet they acted as sort of proto-democrats, creating a partnership and supporting institutions which would then institutionalize democratic power in even further new institutions. And so in the remainder of the lecture now, I want to talk, as advertised, about these three crucial reforms, each of which, I'll argue, was essential to establishing what Athenian democracy came to mean and how it came to operate. So again, radical redistricting, popular agenda setting, and ostracism. So first of all, radical redistricting. So earlier I quoted Herodotus as saying that Kleisthenes established the democracy of the Athenians, but I elided a few words in that quotation. In fact, what he said was, Kleisthenes established the tribes and the democracy of the Athenians. Now you might wonder, why is that important? Is that just a separate thing that he did? We're not used in democratic theory to thinking about tribes as something that's important to democracy. So you might think at best that has nothing to do with the democracy. It's a kind of minor thing that he did. Let's move on and talk about the democracy. But what I want to argue, building on the work of other scholars, is that actually this redistricting of the tribes, which was associated with other forms, changes of organization, names, and numbers of Athenian institutions, was actually at the heart of what it meant to make Athens democratic, because it transformed Athenian identities. It turned men into citizens, as Jean-Jacques Rousseau would also later aspire to do. So what did this mean? Well, previously, the Athenians had tribes. They had 4 tribes, which were based on birth and kinship. So a tribe was based on a family, a gene. But what Kleisthenes did was to turn that into 10 tribes based on localities, on the individual deme, the locality in which one lived. Now again, you might think 4, 10, that doesn't really seem like a democratic hill that we would need to really conquer. It doesn't seem that that would be crucial to what it means for Athens to be a democracy. But in fact, we'll see that the 10 number is significant, but more generally, the crucial thing here is replacing the ties of blood and birth with ties that are created by the democratic city. So this is what it means to change your identity. You change your name, you change your allegiance, you change the very way in which you identify yourself and those to whom you consider yourself to be most fundamentally connected and related. So first of all, we can see that these new tribes were given new names. None of these names of the 10 tribes were the names of the previous 4 tribes. Actually, Kleisthenes sort of went out and dug up the names for these different tribes, and each of them is based on the name of a local hero. But one of the interesting points about this is that one of the tribes is actually based on a foreign hero, on a non-Athenian, the Homeric hero, whom we know from the Iliad, Ajax, who was remembered as having been a neighbor and ally to the city in the kind of legendary history that the Athenians told themselves. And that symbolizes the fact that these new tribes not only gave citizens by birth new identities, but they also allowed for naturalizations. So now that citizenship wasn't based only on kinship, now foreigners could also be enlisted in the new 10 tribes. So this new arrangement of political geography allows for a much more inclusive and expansive understanding of what democratic citizenship means. Moreover, the tribes were now organized in a very significant way. So each tribe was broken into 3 thirds, each had 3 parts, and each part was composed of a selection of those demes that I mentioned, which were based largely on pre-existing villages or localities that were now regimented to be civic subdivisions. So the deme is now the kind of atomic unit of democratic city administration. And what's interesting here is that the old tribes had also had thirds, and so they had, in a way, you could think of a division of 12, 4 tribes, 3 thirds. And so one scholar has commented, this is why Kleisthenes went for 10 and not 12, because he didn't want his 10 to have any overlap with the pre-existing divisions of the earlier arrangement. Instead, he bases them now on this new administrative unit of the demes, and he organizes that in a significant way. And I'm going to show a series of maps, which, with permission, I'm sharing from a new work published in French by 2 French colleagues, scholars, Paulin Ismard and Arnaud Massé, and they have put together these wonderful diagrams in depicting the arithmetic of and the geometry, really, of Kleisthenes' reforms. So in order to appreciate this, we have to see that there were 3 concentric regions of Attica, which is the land of the Athenian city-state. So the little gray in the middle circle is the sort of urban core, where all the buildings that we think of, the Parthenon, the Assembly, and so on, would be located. The Parthenon wasn't yet built. In Zone 2, we have the kind of middle interior, and then Zone 3, the coast. Now the reason, and then with this geography, the reason that this matters is that the big pie pieces here, there are 10. So the biggest slices of the pie are the 10 tribes, and you can see that each of the 10 tribes, schematically, has a piece of each of the 3 geographical regions. So there's a little tiny piece of the dark gray urban core, there's a piece of the interior, and there's a piece of the coast. And the dots represent the demes, which are scattered throughout. So here's the key to what Kleisthenes did. He chose the thirds that made up a given tribe. Each third came from a different one of these geographical regions. So you can see that this tribe, represented here in red, has a little tiny bite of population from the urban core with the demes that are in that. It has a bigger bite from the middle, and it has the largest bite out of the coast. And this is the final map depiction. Here you see the bites in white, and then in red you can see that they compose a single tribe. Now you can see what's so clever and ingenious about this as an achievement of political geography, because what it means is that now your closest relationship, your closest political kin, are not the people who all live next door to you. Some of them are the people who live next door to you. They're the people in your own deme. That's important. But beyond that, there are people who come from many different parts of the city that you might seldom visit, where you have no roots yourself, but now you're enrolled in a group who are meant to collaborate politically and act across these geographical divides. And this is much more radical even than the districting that we have in most modern polities. Most modern polities pride themselves on making their political units contiguous. A given constituency is continuous in its geographical boundary. But Kleisthenes had this insight that in fact what democracy requires are constituencies, as it were, forms of political organization that cut across existing divisions and bring people together, making them legible to one another and helping them to understand their role in the city as a whole. And indeed, Ismard and Marseille argue in their book that the Athenians' ability to work with this new form of political organization rested on everyday mathematical competences that they developed through games, through military musters, through everyday activities, which allowed them to kind of make sense of these forms of multiple division, organization, multiplication, and so on, in which they were now being organized. So I want to add one last piece to the radical redistricting, and this is not about numbers, but about names. And this is about the names not only for the collectivities, as we saw for the tribes, but now the names of individual Athenians. Because the convention prior to Kleisthenes had been that one was named as an Athenian according to one's father's name. But what Kleisthenes did was to move to a demotic naming convention. So if you're Plato, pictured here, you're no longer going to be known primarily or only as Plato of Ariston, Plato the son of Ariston. You're going to be known as Plato of Kolytos, of the deme of Kolytos. And Plato is an excellent example of why this mattered, because again, he's from the most elite Athenian family. He would have probably scorned the idea that he had much in common with these other people who happened to live in his deme. And yet now his primary political identity, the way in which he should be referred, the way in which he should go down in the history books, is as a member of his deme rather than through his familial heritage. And so the demes act really to control the citizen roles, to enroll the citizens, and to judge and define what it means to be an Athenian at the most local and intimate level. And I like to compare this today to the power of the Swiss cantons, which act under federal Swiss law, but under that, each canton is empowered to set its own specific conditions for naturalization of Swiss citizens and to determine who actually gets to become a citizen. So to become a Swiss citizen is to be naturalized within a canton, just as to become an Athenian citizen required naturalization within a deme. And so we can see how politics depends on our identities as a source of civic solidarity. So in sum, what I hope I've persuaded you of in this part of the lecture is that partnering with the people was something that Kleisthenes did not separately from reorganizing the tribes and the demes and the names, but through that. It was through his radical redistricting that he maintained and continued his partnership with the people, which had previously begun. He didn't spurn them or ignore them. He added them to his side, but he did that by enabling them to act together collectively through these new forms of organization, allegiance, and participation. And so what I now want to turn to is how that radical redistricting also played itself out in enabling a new kind of popular agenda setting. So this is the second of the three reforms, and then I'll close with ostracism. So one of the most important functions of the new tribes was to provide the basis for reorganizing the council, which was one of the two most important bodies of the Athenian polis, of the Athenian state, as we can think of it. So there was the assembly, in which all male citizens over the age of 18 were able to attend and vote, but then there was also a council. And there had already been a council. In fact, there was also alongside this another council that also persisted, but I'm just going to compare these two. So Solon had created a council of 400, and Kleisthenes replaces that with a council of 500. Now, again, you might think 400, 500, that hardly seems like the sort of crucial move that we need to understand in understanding the establishment of Athenian democracy. But again, in fact, this Council of 500 being reorganized on the basis of the civic tribes, so that now each tribe is represented at this much more granular level, and now including the poorest citizens, whereas Solon's reform had excluded them. It had set a wealth limit, a wealth threshold for participation in the council. So that change of number, the change of organization was important, but also crucial was what we'll see the council organized. This is where the council met in Athens. This was a picture I was fortunate to take in March on a visit to speak in various institutions there. So this is the remains of the Athenian council. And what Kleisthenes did was to give it this new function of agenda setting for the assembly. Now, you might wonder, why is agenda setting such a crucial aspect of democratic politics? And again, we might think it's more important who gets to vote on what's on the agenda rather than who gets to set the agenda. But in fact, democratic theorists have pointed out that agenda setting is one of the three faces of power. This was argued by the theorist Stephen Lukes. So the first face of power is deciding a question. The second face is setting the agenda, putting something on the agenda. And the third face is keeping something off the agenda. So agenda setting is actually a crucial element of political power, more broadly even than just democratic power. And in the case of the Athenian council, Kleisthenes gave this new council the power to prepare the resolutions which the assembly would then vote upon. Now, when you think about agenda setting then, there's a kind of political functional question, because you might think that it's a good idea to have a separate group that can decide on the agenda, separate from the group which will ultimately vote on it. That might make a kind of functional sense. You could have a different kind of input at the agenda setting stage, more deliberative, perhaps people from a wider range of, or different kinds, perhaps experts, as John Stuart Mill would later argue. We should have experts who prepare laws, and then a democratic parliament can vote on them. So you can see that there might be some value in having a separate agenda setting body from a functional perspective. But on the other hand, there's also the danger that if you set up a separate agenda-setting group, then that might be colonized by an elite who would then undermine the power of the people who are operating in what we might think of as the kind of lower house. So you have this tension between functional advantages and sociological risks, if you want to put it that way. And we can see what happens when we have certain kinds of constitutional arrangements where there is a very different sociological composition between the upper house and the lower house. Now, the functions of the two bodies in the British Constitution are different, so it's not an exact map for the Kleisthenes question, but you can see that this would be a case where you have a very different sociological composition in the two houses. Now, what Kleisthenes did, by contrast, was that he established the functional role. He made the Athenian council have that functional role, but it hardly differed in demographic composition from the assembly. So there was an age difference and different age threshold. You could vote in the assembly at 18. You could only serve on the council from the age of 30. There were a few other requirements associated with being on the council, but it's a relatively small difference. Essentially, the same population of citizens are populating the council in any given year and are able to vote in the assembly. And so Kleisthenes was able to gain the advantages of two distinct chambers with different functions while still preserving the popular control of the agenda for popular votes and allowing that the assembly would not be undermined by the council's role in preparing its business. So what was the result of all of this? Well, the historian Herodotus argued that it helped to establish not only democracy, but democratic freedom. So as he reflected, under the tyrants, the people were working for a master, but after they were freed, they were able to gain an equal voice in government. And we can see how radical redistricting and popular agenda setting function to give the people effectively an equal voice in government. And a modern historian has gone on, Peter Krentz, to say he thinks Herodotus basically got it right. Kleisthenes really did establish democracy through these reforms. We should call this democracy, even though the term demokratia didn't come into use until about half a century later. And then he goes on to say, what did this allow the Athenian people to do? So Krentz writes, by means of resolutions passed by the assembly, I would add prepared by the council. I think that's equally important. So by means of resolutions prepared by the council, passed by the assembly, what did the Athenians do? They achieved all of these great victories and accomplishments of the next 2 to 3 decades of really the Athenian golden age. So first of all, they decided not to take Hippias back as tyrant. The Spartans had tried one more time through machinations to get Hippias back into the city to restore him to the tyranny. The Athenians fended that off. They aided the Ionians who revolted against the Persians. They marched out to the Battle of Marathon and participated in this land battle against the Persians. They built a large fleet. And eventually, they would defend themselves at sea against Xerxes, the Persian king, and of course, win glorious battles in the Persian Wars. So all of this was really made possible by their democracy. It was the redistricting and the agenda setting together created a wellspring of popular power, organized popular power that could be deployed towards each of these ends. And so Herodotus sums up, although Athens had been a great city before, it became even greater once rid of its tyrants, and we can add once under the sway of the Kleisthenic now democracy. So I have one more reform to introduce. And this is the most counterintuitive of the reforms that I'm going to talk about. It's least obvious why this might be a good thing and why it might be an important reform for the establishment and consolidation of Athenian democracy, as I will argue now that it was. So this was the institution of ostracism, and it takes its name from the word ostrakon, which is a shard of pottery, like you see here. This is an actual one from Athens. And what Kleisthenes established was an institution in which every year the assembly had to vote on whether or not an ostracism should be conducted. And if that vote passed, which it didn't always, then every Athenian citizen would be asked to scratch the name of someone who they thought should be ostracized on a fragment of pottery like this. And you had to get 6,000 votes. But if any one person got 6,000 votes that they should be ostracized, then they would be ostracized. And what that meant was that they were exiled from the city for 10 years. They couldn't return to the city. They couldn't play a political role in the city. They were deprived of all of their political rights, as it were. But they were not killed. They were not imprisoned. They were not stripped of their property. They still enjoyed the income from their property if they had it in Athens. It could be sent to them abroad for them to live off, and they could come back to the city at the end of 10 years, and we have examples of those who actually did. Now, you might say, what is this all about? Why is this an important institution for democracy? And indeed, you might think, even if it's an important institution for democracy, it seems profoundly illiberal, because what it meant was that someone could be ostracized for no good reason, and maybe even for no reason at all. So Plutarch tells us this story. This is another general, Aristides, who was so famous and admired that he was known proverbially around the city as Aristides the Just. And so at one point, an ostracism is being conducted, and he's filling in his little potsherd, and he sees someone next to him, a poor citizen who doesn't recognize him, writing Aristides' name. So Aristides says to him, why are you writing my name? And the citizen says, I'm just so, no, he doesn't say my name. He says, why are you writing that name? And the citizen says, I'm just so tired of hearing this guy called the just all the time. It's really annoying. Let's just get rid of him. And in fact, 6,000 people agreed with that, and so he was ostracized. Now, you might think, well, this seems like a bad idea. Here's somebody who's a revered fellow citizen. There's no trial, there's no defense, there's no appeal. You're just ostracized for any reason. So in what way could this be democratic? And it certainly seems illiberal, as later scholars would argue. Benjamin Constant, reflecting on ostracism, takes this to be a notably illiberal measure, as others have as well. So how can we make sense of it? Well, I think the way to make sense of it is against that backdrop of tyranny. Remember that this is established just a few years after a tyranny has been ousted, and even after several decades in which elites had been fighting each other, sometimes to the point of incipient civil war, certainly sort of violent conflict. And so against that backdrop, ostracism could actually appear as a relatively liberal measure. You don't kill your opponent, you don't exile them permanently, you don't dispossess them, you simply exile them for a defined period, and you don't deprive them of their property or of their ultimate membership in the political community. And as the scholar Sarah Forsdyke has argued then, we can see ostracism as an organized use of this mechanism of political exile to warn elites that any aspiration to undue power or influence in the city was being watched and could be checked by the people. So this is really a measure not about exactly exercising democracy itself, but about democracy warding off the return of tyranny by putting elites and anyone who might seem to threaten the people in some way on notice that they are ultimately under popular control and need to respect popular institutions. Now, what I want to conclude by suggesting is that I think that Kleisthenes may have had a very personal reason to bring in this reform, because his mother was not Athenian. She was actually the daughter of someone named Kleisthenes. Kleisthenes is named for his grandfather, but a foreigner, a member of the polis of Sicyon, this is ancient Sicyon, who had served as tyrant in that city a couple of generations before our Athenian Kleisthenes was born. So our Kleisthenes was the Athenian grandson of a foreign tyrant, and you can imagine that he could well have been tempted. He could well have felt the temptation to try his own luck in consolidating a tyranny in Athens in the wake of Pisistratos and his sons, just as Pisistratos had achieved doing. And indeed, Solon before him, it was also thought, might have well chosen to aim at a tyranny. There was nothing really to stop him from trying to consolidate his power in the form of tyranny. So I think that Kleisthenes, having sort of surmounted that temptation, or that possible temptation, really was aware of the temptation that young elites might feel to try to gain power outside the established political rules. And so ostracism makes sense, I think, even more when we understand that personal context. And more generally, I think that having succeeded in moving from tyranny to what would later come to be called democracy, and what I've argued already was, in crucial ways, in Kleisthenes' hands, made into a democracy, I think the Athenians remained all too aware of the possibility of what we today call democratic backsliding. So the possibility that just as democracies are born, so democracies might die. And this is a book by two scholars from Harvard looking historically at how democracies in the modern period do sometimes, in fact, die. So what the Athenians realize in instituting democracy is that popular power requires active and continuing vigilance, not only in democratic participation, but also in warding off the recurrence of tyranny. Thank you very much.